Senator Hyde-Smith. I'm excited to work with you. I know you appreciate the importance of infrastructure and housing in your home state, and we've already talked about some of these priorities. I've had the pleasure of working with Senator Collins for the last 2 years, and we've been able to find common ground on everything from aviation safety to youth homelessness and affordable housing. Every member on this committee knows the importance of stable bridges, efficient airports, and safe cars. And so I look forward to continuing the bipartisan and cooperative nature of this subcommittee with you, Senator Hyde-Smith. Secretary Buttigieg, thank you for appearing today to testify on the President's fiscal year 2024 request for the Department of Transportation. We very much look forward to discussing your sustained focus on safety, equity, and climate at the Department. We are in the second year of implementing the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that brought historic investments to our transportation systems. On a bipartisan basis, we made the right decision to fix our aging infrastructure and begin taking steps to adapt to climate change. But we faced a reversal of that commitment. We do face a reversal of that commitment if we entertain the House majority proposal to return to 2022 funding levels. We'd face an automatic cut of $16 billion simply because of the increase to HUD rental assistance and lowering offsetting receipts from FHA and Ginnie Mae. This would decrease FAA's air traffic controller workforce and safety inspectors and lead to major flight cancellations and delays. And it would hurt all sectors of transportation. We'd face cuts to essential air service, Amtrak, subway service in big cities, and bus service in rural areas. The impact on safety would be even worse. There would be fewer inspections of new Boeing aircraft, fewer inspections of bridges like the one that collapsed in Pittsburgh last year, and fewer inspections of the rail lines like the one in East Palestine. These issues are outlined in a letter from you, Mr. Secretary, to Chairwoman DeLauro, which I'm submitting for the record, and I encourage my colleagues to review. Now is not the time to slash critical investments if we want to sustain the progress we've made in investing in our infrastructure. Instead, we need to build on that success. The President's budget request does exactly that, with strong investments in FAA, rail research, and highway safety. Specifically, it includes a hiring surge for air traffic controllers after the COVID crisis, shutting down the training academy for 2 years. A number of recent near misses have highlighted the need for more training and technology and new ways of thinking throughout the aviation industry. The COVID relief funding for airlines and airports allowed the aviation sector to recover quickly, and it's incumbent on us to have the qualified staff to meet the growing demand. Airlines also need to be held accountable. The Secretary is engaged with the airlines on how to improve the customer experience, and I think more needs to be done. While the budget request was written before the East Palestine incident, we need to work together to improve standards and deploy technologies to prevent future incidents. I support the recommendations to revisit the cost share for rural transit and the benefits this also provide to tribal transportation. I think we need to do more to improve access to competitive programs for tribes where cost share is really a barrier to accessing federal funds. I also need to mention road safety. The National Safety Council estimates that more than 46,000 people were killed in motor vehicle crashes in 2022. That's nearly 10,000 more than 10 years ago. In Hawaii, roadway deaths were up 24% in a 1-year period. Just yesterday, 6 construction workers were killed on the Baltimore Beltway when a driver crashed into a work zone. Too many tragedies like this occur every day, and we know they can be prevented. NHTSA needs to rapidly implement the rules Congress directed, some of which are more than a decade overdue. I want to just say that again. NHTSA needs to rapidly implement the rules that Congress directed, some of which are more than a decade overdue. I look forward to your explanation of the delays and a plan moving forward. With all that said, Secretary Buttigieg, I look forward to hearing your testimony shortly. Ranking Member Hyde-Smith, I want to reiterate how glad I am to see you as ranking member of this subcommittee, and I turn to you for your opening statement.
And let me begin by thanking Chairwoman and the Vice Chairman of the Appropriations Committee for joining us today. And Vice Chairman Collins, I'm certainly committed to upholding your thoughtful and your effective leadership on this subcommittee for the past several years, and appreciate your work there because you have truly been a strong advocate for your constituents and such success on bipartisan working relationships. But I'd also like to thank the Chairman, Schatz, for that kind welcome. Mississippi and Hawaii may be in different time zones and face different transportation infrastructure challenges, but I'm confident that we will find common ground to work together in this subcommittee and address the obstacles facing not only our constituents, but all Americans. And as we work to craft responsible funding legislation for fiscal year 2024, I look forward to continuing the collaborative spirit that you and Vice Chairman Collins have established. I also welcome our witness, Secretary Buttigieg, and I certainly enjoyed our visit yesterday when you came to my office, and I look forward to your testimony, and I look forward to working with you. The department's budget request comes in the wake of, as we've discussed, several serious and troubling incidents across our transportation sectors, including multiple near misses at airports, the closing of our nation's airspace for the first time since 9/11 from an infected file of the Notice to Air Mission Systems, otherwise known as NOTAMs, and numerous derailments, most notably those in East Palestine, Ohio. We must continue to ensure that we have the safest, most reliable transportation network in the entire world, and the appropriations process is the best way to provide oversight and evaluate the funding needs. We also must ensure that our rural communities have adequate support from the federal government. Rural communities face very unique challenges. What works in larger urban areas often does not work in smaller rural areas like those across Mississippi. As such, we must formulate a funding bill that strikes a healthy balance that we can meet the needs of all Americans. The administration's FY24 request in DOT is $108.5 billion, which is 1% increase over the FY23's enacted levels. I'm disappointed to see that even with the proposed increased funding, this request zeroes out programs that are priorities for this subcommittee. Specifically, this budget request zeroes out the RAISE grant program, that the Bridge Formula Program and the Airport Improvement Program supplemental funding. Each of these programs have been very crucial for rural communities, especially in states like Mississippi. Some past projects that I'd like to highlight right now is a RAISE grant award to Yazoo City, Mississippi. Everybody has trouble pronouncing Yazoo City, which will be used to make much-needed infrastructure updates and to revitalize their main street. And an airport improvement program investment at Keyfield in Meridian, Mississippi, to rehabilitate the runway and install a runway guidance system that will improve safety and it'll allow the airport to operate more efficiently. However, pleased to see that the budget request continues to fully fund the Essential Air Service Program, which ensures connectivity to our nation's rural communities as well as investments to modernize and increase safety at the FAA. Smaller airports like the ones located in Greenville, Tupelo, and Hattiesburg, Mississippi benefit from the EAS program to ensure safe travel for customers needing access to smaller markets. New businesses will rarely locate in areas without dependable commercial air service, so these smaller airports are very vital for the economic development in these areas. Additionally, the budget request includes robust funding for the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvements Grant programs to develop a safer rail network. So I believe that the funding decisions need to be met with fiscal responsible decision-making that ensures taxpayers are prioritized also. With that in mind, Secretary Buttigieg, I look forward to hearing from you and working together for the American people. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Are there any members wishing to make an opening statement? If not, Secretary Buttigieg, please proceed with your testimony.
Well, thank you very much, Chair Schatz, Ranking Member Hyde-Smith, Vice Chair of the committee, Collins, and all of the members of the subcommittee here for the opportunity to discuss the President's fiscal year 24 budget request for the Department of Transportation, totaling $145 billion. The budget will propel our department's work across our three major categories of effort: running our operations well in the agency, building good things well across the country, and protecting the safety and well-being of everyone who interacts with America's transportation systems. In each of these areas, of course, Congress plays a fundamental role, and I want to thank members on both sides of the aisle who have been true partners as we have worked to build a stronger, safer transportation system. I join you today at a moment of historic challenge as well as opportunity in our transportation systems as they cope with profoundly disruptive forces that include continued shockwaves from the coronavirus pandemic, increasing threats from climate change, and the effects of decades of disinvestment, which are thankfully coming to an end as we implement the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. A further source of instability has to do with the conduct of many players in transportation-related industries. Over the years, a drastic tendency away from competition and toward concentration has developed, while at the same time, many of the biggest firms were slashing staff and costs, often boosting their profitability, but too often at the public's expense. The result is a transportation system today that is still too vulnerable, and when any part of it strains or breaks, the costs are borne by the American people. But we're also in a moment of tremendous opportunity and progress. We are making infrastructure investments across the country, using the funds that Congress entrusted to us, and we are seeing some new and welcome bipartisan support in this chamber for much-needed safety regulations on freight railroads, including a number of policies we had been calling for and which we strongly support. I'd like to highlight a few vital areas where we have made progress in the last year and the further strides we can make through the President's fiscal year 24 budget. On aviation, we are getting airlines to honor the tickets that they sell while advancing safety measures across industry and within the FAA. But there is still far more to do, as recent events make clear. The 2024 budget invests $24.8 billion to make needed investments to add air traffic controllers, improve the safety and capacity of America's airports, and accelerate the modernization of critical systems and infrastructure such as the notice-to-air emissions system. On rail, we've made nearly $18 billion available to improve rail service and safety and published our proposed rule requiring a minimum of 2 trained crew members. Derailments may be down compared to prior decades, but we are still seeing far too many. For every community like East Palestine that has been impacted, and every community wondering if they're next, the status quo is clearly not acceptable. The President's budget includes $273 million to support Federal Railroad Administration safety personnel, expand inspection capabilities, and increase stakeholder engagement to address risks. Meanwhile, we've put 3,700 bridges and almost 70,000 miles of road on the path to improvement, which means a safer ride and lower maintenance costs for millions of families and truck drivers. And we awarded grants for the first ever Safe Streets and Roads for All program. We still see far too many fatal crashes on our roads, and I want to join the chair in pausing to acknowledge the tragic crash on I-695 in Maryland yesterday when a driver entered a work zone, struck, and killed multiple workers. We cannot and must not accept that roadway fatalities are an inevitable part of life in America. Our budget includes $3.1 million for the Highway Safety Improvement Program, new funding for safer walking and biking infrastructure, advanced safety research initiatives, and SMART grants like the ones we awarded just this week that pilot innovative solutions to protect drivers, pedestrians, bicyclists, and construction workers. With regard to transit, we've advanced projects from bus rapid transit in Charleston to light rail in Seattle. The budget includes $4.45 billion for capital investment grants to move forward with major projects that improve American transportation for generations, like the Hudson River tunnels and the Front Runner double track project in Salt Lake City. And the budget also includes policy proposals that would allow transit agencies the flexibility they need to adapt to post-pandemic shifts in ridership. For supply chains, we've made critical investments in ports from Columbus, Mississippi to Los Angeles so that goods move more quickly. And we've taken measures that have helped the course of Pacific shipping rates go down by 80%. This budget provides $230 million for the Port Infrastructure Development Program to build on this important work. There's a great deal of progress underway and a great deal yet to be done. Together, we are stewards of a transportation system finally seeing renewal in its physical foundations, but showing real points of vulnerability that endanger communities and workers, especially in the places where federal oversight and regulation have been undermined. Congress was able to pass a bipartisan infrastructure law of proportions that eluded our predecessors for decades, Now, we need that same bipartisan strength to sustain these ongoing infrastructure investments, to make progress on safety regulations, and to protect Americans counting on that infrastructure. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Let me start with the FRA. What's FRA doing to review the performance of wayside detection technologies, railroad standards for an emergency notification, and emergency response procedures?
So these wayside detection devices are installed alongside tracks, and they can provide advance warning when there are issues that couldn't be detected by other means. Not all derailments are caused by an issue in the rail. Sometimes it's an issue on board. This is something that historically has not been the subject of federal regulation, although we did put out a safety advisory in the wake of the East Palestine case from FRA regarding this. But we have seen them deployed by a number of railroads and are interested in working with Congress as well as examining our existing authorities to create more regularity and standardization about the use of these tools, because we think they can play an important role in preventing crashes and derailments.
And I think that's perfect. I think we're going to have to get our lawyers together to figure out whether you have all the authorities you need, and if so, then we'll push you to utilize those authorities to get some sort of standardization. But if you need statutory authority, I don't think this is particularly controversial that each railroad should not have their own boutique version of this. This is a safety question, and there should be standards across the industry. I just want to talk to you about airport resiliency. The short version of this is that lots of runways are going to be facing coastal inundation. And so this is not a climate policy question, right? That's not the jurisdiction of this committee. But to the extent that the sea level is rising, that has impacts across the country in our airports. Do you have the authority you need to help airports to respond to that? And are you doing enough to encourage airports to recognize whatever your politics are about energy policy or this or that, or the Inflation Reduction Act? The very pragmatic question in front of us is how do we prevent sea level rise from damaging our airports?
Well, we're certainly doing all we can with the authorities that we have. The FAA supports airport sponsors that include resiliency in their master planning effort, and those master plans are eligible for funding through AIP. And we're certainly encouraging those airports, those project sponsors, to work with their local district offices to develop scope of analyses dealing with resiliency that may not have been contemplated specifically in the past. The 23 enacted appropriation gave FAA the authority to use supplemental funds specifically to address resiliency, and we'd welcome opportunities to work with Congress to continue that kind of support, because I believe the need for attention to resiliency affecting all of our infrastructure, certainly affecting airports, is only going to grow each passing year.
Yeah, I just want to point out, the model here is the DOD, right? The DOD doesn't get to have an opinion necessarily about climate action or whatever, but they have bases and installations, and they don't have the luxury of pretending that there aren't some issues, especially with our Navy bases. Moving on to some tribal issues. A real barrier for tribes to access federal competitive grants is the cost share requirement. Would you support expanding the cost share waiver proposed in the budget more broadly to FTA competitive programs for tribes?
Yes, we have this in the tribal transit formula and competitive programs, but not other FTA programs. And when I'm meeting with tribal leaders when we're traveling in Indian country, we hear this refrain again and again and again. Sometimes 20% of those projects would not always look like a large figure from a Washington perspective, but to those tribes it could be the difference between a project happening and not happening, so we would love to work on that.
The IIJA requires NHTSA to finalize a rule on impaired driving. Are we on time? Can you give me an update, please?
Yeah, so NHTSA will soon be posting an annual report that's going to share more detailed information on the rulemaking status, and I'm going to defer to that report on anticipated timelines. But what I can tell you is that NHTSA is working very hard to develop the advance notice of proposed rulemaking, including on areas like the impaired driving detection technology, which is novel and different from the kinds of things that they have prescribed in the past, but that we recognize the urgency, importance, and interest of, given its potential to prevent crashes and fatalities.
Final question. The President in his State of the Union said, quote, "And when we do projects, we're going to buy American." Buy American has been the law of the land since 1933, but for far too long, past administrations have found a way to get around it. Not anymore. you are about to give out billions in federal funds through grants to many agencies. Do we have your commitment to comply with Buy America, which is statutory, but also with what the president is saying about actually complying and not just having every agency waive the statute?
Yes, not only has, as you noted, this law has been on the books for a long time, but the president is exceptionally, I would argue, historically focused on making sure that we buy America, and that's something you'll see throughout the administration.
Thank you. Senator Hyde-Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you know, Mr. Secretary, there have been significant increases in near misses and runway incursions occurring all over the country. And whether it's Texas, California, Massachusetts, or most recently here in Washington, D.C., these incursions are not subsiding, and they are very alarming. According to data we received from the FAA, in calendar year 2022, there were 1,696 runway incursion incidents, and since the beginning of this year, we've already had 266 runway incursions incidents. Even with the significant investment Congress provided the FAA in FY23, we're still seeing very concerning, unacceptable numbers, and you yourself just recently expressed your concerns about the FAA's lack of accountability for these runway incursions as last week's safety summit. But knowing that most of us here in the Senate, we fly on a weekly basis, and we certainly encounter our own flight mishaps from cancellations due to mechanical problems or crew staffing problems, it just seems that it's just another reason to be concerned about the safety of the traveling public. Given this committee has been providing funds to address runway incursions specifically for several years, why are existing safety measures that have been previously used to mitigate these incursions no longer effective?
Well, I do want to emphasize the effectiveness of our safety systems in terms of maintaining an aviation system that is exceptionally safe, while recognizing that we can't just rest on that without continually working to raise the bar. And what I mean by that is that while it is an extraordinary fact that in a typical year the number of passengers losing their lives in commercial aviation crashes is zero, we need to be just as animated and just as energized about these near misses. Now, the runway incursion numbers that we pay the most attention to are the severe ones. They're called Category A or B, and there is a definite increase in those types of incidents. In past years, they've occurred at a rate of roughly once per month. Right now, they are this year occurring at a rate that is roughly double that. And of course, the only number we want to see, again, is zero. This is why the FAA convened the Safety Summit last week, took a number of steps and is continuing to take steps, including this week, what's called a SAFO, or a safety alert, going throughout the system to encourage a higher degree of vigilance, while we're also looking at engineering solutions that might make a difference. We think that the uptick is partly related to the exceptionally fast surge in demand and the swift return to the skies, faster than even the most optimistic scenarios that we heard a couple of years ago. We need to make sure, of course, that as that system comes back to that high level of demand, there is no negative safety impact to that. We don't take for granted for a second the safety record of U.S. aviation, and we'll continue to be focused on maintaining that. And that is reflected in the budget with requested funds for system modernization, also for increased staffing in air traffic control so that there is less pressure on the existing workforce, and we know that that demand is only going to grow.
And so you think that with the requests that you have in now, you think that that would help mitigate a lot of this?
Yes, I think that will keep us on track for continuing to make the improvements that need to be made. FAA is rightly concerned with maintaining gains from the past, yet not thinking that that's enough, or as I've heard it put memorably, viewing safety never as a destination, that you get there and then you're satisfied, but as a continual journey. These funds will help us to take another fiscal year's worth of step on that journey.
Okay, and one thing that another one I want to ask you about, because it's really important, there's such a driver shortage in the trucking industry. And last month, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration provided my staff with participation data for the Safe Driver Apprenticeship pilot program, which I was really excited about because hopefully we can meet the needs of this. Boy, we learned a lot after COVID with the supply chains. But this 3-year pilot program was included in the infrastructure law and is based on the Drive Safe Act, and that I co-sponsored last Congress. Outside of this pilot, current law provides 18 to 20-year-olds from operating a commercial motor vehicle in interstate commerce. This means that a 20-year-old driver in Mississippi is allowed to drive more than 350 miles from Gulfport, Mississippi to South Haven at the very northern end of the state, but cannot drive the extra mile from South Haven to Memphis, Tennessee, which is right there, and obviously a great need right there. This makes little practical and economic sense to me, but although the pilot program is intended to accommodate up to 1,000 carriers and 3,000 enrolled apprentices at any given time, the initial participation data is just alarmingly underwhelming. At the time of the presentation from the FMCSA, only 21 carriers had been approved for participation, and 4 apprentices were in the program. 1, 2, 3, 4. We could take up to 3,000. So some in the trucking industry have indicated that burdensome program requirements, which were not included in the Drive Safe Act nor the infrastructure bill, are a major deterrent to carrier participation. For example, the FMCSA requires participants to install inward-facing cameras on themselves in the vehicles, which invites legitimate concerns about privacy. And if the participation rate remains this low of 4, it is unlikely that the pilot will provide enough credible data to inform future policy making on this issue. So what are DOT and the FMCSA doing to improve participation in the program and to ensure that requirements hindering enrollment are removed? Because this is huge in Mississippi. We need drivers.
Well, FMCSA is hard at work launching this pilot. We're able to take applications beginning last summer, and as you noted, I think it's up to 22 motor carriers are approved. We got another 22 that have been approved by FMCSA and are just working through the process. So far, we would like to see, we agree, we'd like to see a higher level of participation. So some steps on that have included making information available to 1,500 carriers who meet the safety requirements. FMCSA did that some weeks ago. There's also a paid media campaign that took place in February that we're hoping will build interest, and we'll continue using social media and outreach to the high school graduating class of 2023 about this program. Any requirement that is in the program is for the purpose of safety, and safety will always be our first priority. But we are very interested in getting the level of participation that'll get us good data to see if we can continue in this direction without compromising safety.
Thank you, because that is a real concern when I saw those numbers. That's a really concern there. Okay, I'll save my questions for another round and give somebody else an opportunity now.
Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Schatz, Ranking Member Hyde-Smith, Vice Chair Collins. Welcome, Secretary Buttigieg. Look forward to talking with you this morning. Let's start, if we can, with rail. Rail's a real concern for my community. We have one of the busiest passenger rail stations in America, named for our president, but we also have very busy freight rail lines that run up and down the backbone of the East Coast. I appreciate your continued work to implement the bipartisan infrastructure law, which is benefiting the state of every senator. But we have to continue to provide robust funding for DOT programs in order for us to actually achieve the vision of the bipartisan infrastructure bill. On Amtrak, America's passenger rail system, you're requesting a 20% increase over FY23 enacted levels. In no area of transportation do I think your phrase in your opening statement, decades of disinvestment, is it more real than in our rail infrastructure, something that's been tragically highlighted in recent weeks. I will lead the letter endorsing Amtrak's $3.65 billion request to ensure robust funding of the Northeast Corridor and our national network. And as I've previously raised, Amtrak's funding needs were not addressed by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act. There was a significant and helpful down payment, but the framing assumed steady annual appropriations. This is something I rely on for my transportation to and from work, so it's particularly personal to me. I know for 36 years, our president also commuted by rail, as do millions of others across our country. How can we continue to support Amtrak and ensure the Northeast Corridor is a reliable, safe means of transportation?
Well, Amtrak is a vitally important economic asset to the entire country, certainly with regard to the Northeast Corridor. And as you mentioned, our president famously is enthusiastic and focused on this, as is the administration. Amtrak will be growing its workforce and will have to in order to be able to make good on the opportunities that are coming by way of the investments and implementing the $22 billion in advance appropriations provided by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, while, as you noted, requiring more resources for many of the things that I think passengers, customers, and communities expect. I know that they had, at last time we checked in February, nearly 20,000 workers. They've set a goal to hire almost 4,800 more in 2023. So whether it's the physical infrastructure side, where we as a department are most likely to, and most often partnering with them, whether it's the workforce growth that they need to undertake, or a third area I would point to that's important in terms of the reliability of the system, less on the Northeast Corridor, but overall, which is ensuring that the legal requirement of the freight railroads to make way for passengers is met. I think all of these will continue to need sustained attention, and we welcome opportunities to work with Congress to make sure that the funding and the authorities align.
Thank you. Delaware has long been a site of significant Amtrak operations, both the Wilmington shops and the Bear shops for repair and maintenance. We have the National Operations Center, and DOT recently gave a Railroading 101 program grant to our State Department of Labor, the U.S. Department of Labor gave our State Department of Transportation a grant to try and help grow future railroading workforce. As the ranking member noted, in trucking we have a real challenge, but we also do in railroading in order to take advantage of construction, maintenance, and operations opportunities. Let me also ask you about heavy trucks and hydrogen. Senator Cornyn and I are co-sponsors, along with 6 of our colleagues, bipartisan co-sponsors of the Hydrogen for Trucks Act. It would accelerate the deployment of clean hydrogen to decarbonize heavy-duty transport. Fuel cell trucks have all the benefits of diesel-powered trucks, but without the emissions. But in the early stages of deployment of promising fuel cell technologies, there's going to be a need to lower cost barriers and to provide both gathering critical data so that what's manufactured and deployed is demonstrably safe and better understood, and to provide some incentives for early adopters. How's the department thinking about supporting operators interested in adding hydrogen fuel cell trucks to their fleets? And do you think the kind of incentive program that's laid out in my bipartisan bill with Senator Cornyn would be helpful to accelerating adoption of these vehicles?
We welcome the work that you and your bipartisan colleagues are doing, because it is another piece of the puzzle of having more sustainable transportation for the future. It's one thing for light-duty vehicles, cars we all own, that we have existing on-the-street available technology that is zero emissions. The story is more complex for buses, and I would add, for trucks rather, but I would add buses to that. And in addition to some of the tools we do have to work with, like the Charging and Fuel Infrastructure Discretionary Grant Program we just put out, and the FTA's work on the bus side, would certainly be interested in continuing to partner with you on expanding the availability and the support for hydrogen, because we know as you look at the harder to decarbonize elements of our transportation systems, surface for sure with the trucks and buses, but also as we look ahead to the long-term future of aviation and shipping, there's no question that hydrogen will be an important thing to consider.
Well, we have a number of critical companies doing cutting-edge research and development and deployment in hydrogen for transportation and otherwise in Delaware, and some great opportunities. I recently had a chance to ride in a heavy-duty truck on I-95 from Newark to Wilmington, and was really struck at how far along this technology is. Let me close by thanking you for the $270 million investment in FRA safety initiatives that's in the budget after the tragic derailment in East Palestine. We want to work together with you and with the bipartisan group of my colleagues who are proposing improvements in rail safety, and I want to make sure that we stay engaged in this as a Congress. Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Senator.
Vice Chair Collins.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Before I go to my questions, I want to welcome the new ranking member of the subcommittee, Senator Hyde-Smith. She will be an absolutely terrific partner for you. And I can assure you, Senator, that Chairman Schatz will also be a great partner. I have been either the chair or ranking member of the subcommittee for many, many years, and it's great to know that it's in such good hands. And those compliments do not count against my time.
Noted.
Thank you.
Compliments never count against your time.
Mr. Secretary, welcome. The administration is proposing once again to zero out important programs like the Bridge Formula program. In fiscal year 23, Congress provided more than $1 billion in funding for the Bridge Formula program, which benefits many rural states, including my state of Maine. As you know, this is a program that was created by this very subcommittee, and it has been very effective in improving and replacing our nation's deteriorating bridges. In addition, as the ranking member has pointed out, the budget includes no funding for the popular and effective RAISE grant program. This program, too, has been essential to roadway, bridge replacement, and port projects across the country, including in my state of Maine. The budget request instead is shifting these important programs to be funded solely by the bipartisan infrastructure funding rather than complementing annual appropriations. I was one of the 10 negotiators of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, and I can unequivocally state that the funding from that historic law was intended to be supplemental. It was not intended to supplant the regular appropriations. So proposing to eliminate the annual appropriations not only conflicts with clear congressional intent, but also dilutes the impact and limits the reach of the program. And I must say, the administration has been very quick to laud the bipartisan infrastructure program, to take credit for its role in shaping it, but now it's submitted a budget that dilutes its impact. Can you explain to me why you're allowing for supplanting the funding rather than following congressional intent?
Well, let me first associate myself with your remarks about the RAISE program, which is both popular and highly effective. And in my travels in particular, as I visit communities where we've been able to fund projects through that program, you can see the effect that it has. Likewise, we continue to enthusiastically pursue the deployment of the funds that are available to us in the Bridge program and others that were contemplated both in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and could be subject to future opportunities for appropriation as well. It's of course challenging in any budget to make sure that the top line conforms with the President's and the public's and the Congress's expectations about fiscal responsibility. We've sought to strike that balance in the right way, ensuring that there are additional funds for projects, including in discretionary programs that we know are very sought after across the country. But you have my commitment that our department will continue, whether it's RAISE, the Bridge program, or others, to make the absolute most of the funding that we have by way of that advance appropriation and continue the dialogue about how to make sure that needs are met, balanced, of course, with the fiscal responsibility concerns that you all must balance in your appropriating role.
Let me bring up another issue. I met this week with the State Maritime Academy presidents to talk about the state-of-the-art training vessels that we have been appropriating. They're technically called the National Security Multi-Mission Vessels. And this subcommittee worked really hard to replace them in order of age. We did one per year, and we've now funded all 5, with the first being scheduled to be delivered later this year. And yet, the President's budget does not include funding to continue the support for the shoreside infrastructure improvements at our nation-state maritime academies that are necessary for berthing these newly constructed vessels. And I don't understand that, because we're not going to get the benefits to the cadets, nor to the merchant marine, nor to our military, nor to our nation in general, if the administration doesn't help fund the infrastructure required to accommodate and operate these ships. Why did the administration slash this account? And I use the word slash advisedly.
Well, we are excited about what these NSMVs are going to mean for the future of the Merchant Marine, for the cadets, and for the country. We're very much looking forward to construction and delivery proceeding. The President's budget for '24 includes $19.2 million to cover some unanticipated steel cost increases for one of the vessels. It continues funding for the program, and also flexibility for management of the fleet following the construction and delivery of the vessels and through their life cycle. But there is, I think, going to have to be a continued conversation about the responsibilities on the vessel itself and then the shoreside resources. We provided notification last month of our intent to obligate fiscal '22 funds for some improvements that will be needed on the shore side. But I think we do need to continue that dialogue with the maritime academies so that there's clear, predictable, and responsible balance between what's provided by MARAD and what's provided at the academy level to make sure that there's appropriate shoreside support.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have many more questions, but I'd ask to submit them for the record.
That's fine, and we're going to try to do a second round if the time permits. Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for mentioning the terrible crash we had in Baltimore County at I-695 yesterday. Mr. Secretary, thank you for acknowledging that as well. 6 people were killed in a construction worker zone. I am pleased, Mr. Secretary, that the NTSB is investigating that crash. And we all look forward to improving road safety to avoid these terrible tragedies. On a much happier note, I want to thank you and the President for your work implementing the infrastructure modernization bill. It was good to have you and the President in Baltimore for the announcement of the $4 billion investment to upgrade a 150-year-old tunnel and replace it with the new Frederick Douglass Tunnel. That's going to cut down on Amtrak train times between Baltimore and the D.C. by a huge amount and make it much more efficient and safe for travelers. I was also very pleased that the Department of Transportation awarded Baltimore City $2 million in a planning grant under the Reconnecting Communities program. You and I, Mr. Secretary, have spoken about this project many times. There was a gross injustice committed in the 1960s. A highway was begun through West Baltimore, displacing over 1,000 homes, cutting right through an African-American community, and then the highway was stopped, never completed, but the scar remained. So this is a very important project, and as you know, the Reconnecting Communities program was included in the infrastructure bill specifically with the Highway to Nowhere, West Baltimore in mind. That's why we worked to establish the program legislatively and then insert it into the infrastructure bill. So first I want to thank you and the department. This is obviously the first step in making sure that we reconnect that community. Finally, I wanted to mention the Red Line in Baltimore. This was a major transit project in Baltimore City that had been supported by the Maryland delegation for years. Our immediately past governor pulled the plug on that, even though we had lined up the $1 billion funding to move forward with the project. Our new governor, Wes Moore, is very interested in moving forward, as is Mayor Scott. Senator Cardin and I included language in the infrastructure bill just highlighting the importance of this project and making clear that full consideration should be given to previous projects that were pretty much ready to go in the event they're resubmitted. So I just wanted to put that again on your radar screen. My question relates to the Transit Worker Pedestrian Protection Act. This is something I worked on, had legislation we also included in the infrastructure bill. And the purpose is to establish a safety committee made up of union representatives and management representatives in transit agencies in order to make sure that we deal with transit worker safety and protection and pedestrian protection. This is a serious problem. Last week, we had a hearing in the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee where we had testimony from the president of Baltimore's ATU Local 1300. The night before the hearing in the Banking Committee, he had been in a hospital in Baltimore visiting with a fellow transit worker who'd been stabbed twice on the job. So it just highlighted the urgency of implementing this program. In Baltimore, things are moving ahead. As of last week, the information we had was 1/3 of ATU's bargaining units reported that management had not established the Joint Safety Committee. As of this morning, apparently we've made some progress. There are still, however, dozens left, Mr. Secretary. And according to ATU, they're being told in many cases by local transit agencies that it's ATU's job to do this, when clearly it's FTA's responsibility to make sure that this provision of law is implemented. And the law also says that those transit agencies should not be getting any grant funding for other programs until this is done. So I just ask for your commitment today to make sure that we swiftly and fully implement that provision.
Thanks. You have that commitment. We have communicated to the agencies that they need to certify that they have one of these committees stood up. If they don't, that puts their access to federal funding at risk. We need to be doing everything we can to protect transit workers, and let's make clear that it is completely unacceptable to have any kind of assault, violence, threats, or intimidation directed against these frontline workers. I've heard these same themes in meeting with workers and their representatives. This has the attention of the FTA administrator, has my attention as well, and we will continue our focus on making sure that transit agencies are doing everything they can and that we're doing everything we can.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Secretary. How are your babies?
Thank you for asking. They're doing all right.
As we were talking about earlier, my father used to tell me, you'll never know love until you have a child.
It's a different kind of love.
It is a
Secretary.
different kind of love.
It's a wonderful thing.
I want to ask you a philosophical question, Mr. Secretary. How you and your team go about deciding whether to promulgate a new rule. Let me give you an example. Study after study has shown that the number of teenagers you have in a car is directly proportional to their chance of having a wreck. And we've known this for years. I'm not recommending this rule, because frankly, I don't know how I'd vote on it if it came to us. But suppose one of your team members came to you and said, look, if we promulgate a rule that you can't have, if you have a teenage driver, you can't have any other teenagers in the car with that teenage driver. How would you go about analyzing that?
Well, in this type of case, it would likely reflect the traditional division of labor that we've had between the federal government and the states, in that the federal government tends to regulate the design of a vehicle, the design of the roads, and safety issues related to that physical infrastructure and the physical vehicle, while state DMVs and state laws tend to regulate the conduct of a driver. So the very thing you're mentioning, for example, I think is why in some states there's a gradual approach where when you have your learner's permit, you can be behind the wheel, but there are restrictions on who could be in the vehicle with you for exactly that reason. I know you're asking this philosophically and not in terms of the particular policy that you're using as an illustration, but to zoom out more generally, we would look, as my answer up to now might indicate, at our authorities and our responsibilities. We'd look at the data and where it leads us. We'd look at what we think is likely to happen if we were to promulgate a rule like that. And then, of course, we'd get a lot of feedback. We would make sure that we have an understanding of what the different stakeholders think is important, information we might not be privy to. Now, having said all of that, the truth is it's rarely the case that we imagine a rule and go out into a universe as a blank slate and find out what might happen around it. Usually there has been dialogue, debate, and data building up for years that makes a potential rule rise higher on the list of a department that can only take so many regulatory steps at a time. And of course, is also working to revise and occasionally withdraw older rules that are still on the books. But hopefully that gives you some sense of the approach that we would take and that we do take when we're thinking about our rulemaking authorities.
Okay. I'm going to get in one other question while I have time. In fiscal year 2021, in our appropriations bill, we created, we meaning Congress, a National Center of Excellence for Liquefied Natural Gas Safety. And the statute, I'll just quote it to you, it's short. Quote, in determining, this is what the statute says, in determining the location of the center, the Secretary shall, not may, but shall, locate the center in the state with the largest LNG production capacity as determined by the total capacity in billion cubic feet per day of LNG production authorized by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission under Section 3 of the Natural Gas Act as of the date of enactment of this act. That's Louisiana. Louisiana has a production capacity of 21.2 billion cubic feet a day. Your Pipeline and Hazardous Material Safety Administration doesn't seem to want to locate the center in our state, my state. Can you tell me why, if you know?
I'll have to consult with the Pipeline and Hazardous Safety and Material Administration to understand the latest on that Center of Excellence, but I can certainly tell you that we, of course, ensure any choice we make is conforming with statute, and so I'll want to make sure that whatever is underway is consistent with the law as written.
If you would look at it, I know you have a lot of things on your plate, but the law is pretty clear. And personal preference is not supposed to enter into this. And I think my state is clearly number one in production capacity. And I've noticed a determined reluctance by some of your agency folks to make this decision and put it in my state. Now, I'd much rather just have them be up front and tell me why.
I'll make sure to find out.
Thank you.
Thanks, Senator.
Chair Murray.
Well, thank you very much, Chair Schatz and Ranking Member Hyde-Smith. I look forward to working with you and Vice Chair Collins and all the members of this subcommittee as we return to regular order and work to find common ground to build a strong competitive economy for families across our country. Today's hearing is really an important opportunity to assess what resources that is going to require, and it does come amid some very stark reminders that keeping our country strong means keeping our infrastructure strong. We all know about the recent trail derailment and spill in East Palestine, Ohio. There's also one last week in the Swinomish Tribal Reservation in my home state of Washington. And we've seen some disturbingly close calls in air travel lately. So as we are writing the funding bills for this year ahead, we absolutely have to remember that keeping our families safe and our nation competitive is, of course, about defense spending, but it's also important to remind ourselves that safety and our families' safety is dependent on non-defense spending as well. And when it comes to protecting our families, we have to make sure that our people and our goods get safely and efficiently from point A to point B. And when it comes to keeping our economy competitive, we can't compete with China without well-run ports who ship American goods out to the world. And I'm proud to say my home state of Washington has some of the best. We know we can't compete with without strong public transportation networks that connect our communities and are accessible to everybody and strengthen our local economies and get people to work and school and more. And of course, we can't compete when it comes to clean energy and reducing emissions without investing in green transportation. So this bipartisan infrastructure law that we passed laid a really good, strong foundation for an infrastructure decade. And now we have to build on that to make sure that we can complete the projects in our communities that are so badly needed, like the I-5 bridge project in Southwest Washington you're well aware of, or expanding Sound Transit's light rail system. So I look forward to hearing more from Secretary Buttigieg about why projects like this are important and what we need to keep that momentum going. But I wanted to ask you today about the recent derailments in Ohio and in my state, and how they really demonstrate some significant vulnerabilities in our nation's rail system. We've been here before with crude oil incidents, and I worked with the administration then through this subcommittee actually to require comprehensive oil spill response plans and funding to improve safety practices and training for our short line and regional railroads. Secretary, there are just a few examples of steps we took to increase safety around crude oil. Could you expand those efforts now for other hazardous materials?
Thank you for your attention to this issue and for the question. The short answer is yes. Often what happens is that America learns from an experience, a disaster, and I know that your work and others on this committee was part of responding to some horrific crashes, derailments, and incidents that took place in the early 2000s that led to things like the creation of the category of the high hazard flammable unit train. And while that was, I think, a successful response to that type of tragedy, questions arose in the wake of East Palestine from people who asked the very reasonable question, looking at that horrific smoke column and fireball coming out of the vinyl chloride controlled burn, that if this train did not meet the legal or technical definition of a high hazard flammable train, what would? Yeah. And so I think this is compelling us to revise and review both the HHFUT definitions in particular, and then more broadly, the authorities and the definitions that we are working with, some of which are in statute, and we welcome the legislation on a bipartisan basis that's emerging in this chamber to do some things that we think are important, from stiffer fines for safety violations to specific concrete technical measures that could make a difference. We are also acting with the authorities that we do have. Recent safety advisories on valve caps for tank cars are just one example. And are calling on industry not to wait for us to require it of them, to do the right thing on their end. And with regard to your question here, I would point to the importance of early notification for communities when hazardous material is passing through them. That is still not as rigorous as we believe it ought to be. The legislation would raise the bar on that, but I don't think that industry should wait for legislation. Yeah. We certainly won't, to view that as the right thing to do.
Yeah, well, I know this budget was prepared before those derailments, but can you talk a little bit how you're using existing resources to increase rail safety, and maybe what's in this budget that will help you with that?
Yes, well, the budget was proposed before the East Palestine crash took place. It already reflects a number of steps that we've been wanting to take or expand, including growing FRA's capacity with regard to railroad safety. And I would divide that into a couple of relevant categories. One has to do with enforcement and compliance, but another research. So for example, the wayside detection devices that could have played a role here are something that have been developed partly through collaboration with the FRA, and obviously we need to continue looking at how that technology could help to prevent future derailments and crashes. So it's certainly reflected here in the budget, increasing the agency's railroad safety personnel, expanding inspection and audit capabilities, enhancing data analysis that'll help us identify root causes and better interpret the NTSB data that comes as they do their independent work, and increasing the stakeholder outreach and partnerships. And just to give you one example of what's in the budget, there's $17 million for the automated track inspection program and $4.5 million to support efforts to expand the confidential close call reporting system, which we think is important. And of course, we'll continue evaluating what else could make a difference as we look to the future.
Well, thank you very much, and I will submit my remaining questions for the record, but really appreciate your being here. And again, look forward to working with you as we put this bill together.
Thanks very much, Chair Murray. Senator Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, and thank you for having the initial hearing, and it's good to see you again, Mr. Secretary. If this had been last year, you and I went round and round over the Federal Highways Memorandum of Guidance in terms of where dollars should be spent. And we had a disagreement, but I'm glad to see you saw the light and pulled the memo down because it was causing a lot of angst in terms of our state DOTs being able to move forward. So I also want to thank you. Shaylin Bad has been very conversive with us and many other members here in the Senate, and I'm glad to see we have a permanent person in there now, a confirmed person, so he's doing a good job. But I am hearing that some of the project grant agreements across any are taking increasingly longer to complete. These types of delays can obviously cost project costs, delay much, and time's a ticking on the infrastructure bill. I'm also told that the grant debriefs for people that don't get granted that are offered by the department are becoming less and less helpful. So historically, these have been able to equip our applicants to be able to reapply and then in the following years to have a much more successful and impactful application. So I would hope that, I guess I'm concerned about just the delays and then these debriefs. Wanted to bring them to your attention because they're being brought to my attention, and ask that you would identify additional ways that we can move these projects quicker, and also that we can help with the debriefs to make sure they're as substantive as they can be.
Well, thanks. The goal of compressing the timeline between an award announcement and a grant agreement is one that I enthusiastically share. There are a number of steps, of course, that have to happen. It's taxpayer money, but we've got to find ways to streamline that process without losing any of the fidelity to the reasons why it's there. And that's something that we take very seriously because we want to get not just the projects identified, but of course, to get them built. Now, some steps that we've already taken to try to ease that include steps to reduce the number of independent processes and consolidate them, and to work with project sponsors as they're getting through NEPA, for example. We'll often have a project that is not yet finalized its NEPA process, but already identified for funding. We need to make sure, or sometimes they don't even have the engineering, the final design work done. And that can be necessary to sign a grant agreement. So we're going to do everything we can on our end. But we also want to work with project sponsors to help them do what they have to on their end, recognizing that even if it's a requirement that they must meet, we're not going to sit back and just say, you're on your own, good luck meeting those requirements. We really want to partner with them to get that done. Likewise with the debriefs, that's something that I consider very important for unsuccessful project applicants who often turn into successful applicants later on. Would love offline to get more information about some of the specific feedback you're getting, so that we can examine that and make sure the process is useful.
So it seems it is while the desire may be to shorten, it seems as though the desire is not quite being met because it's becoming increasingly long. So let's talk about one federal decision. That's in the IIJA. We're looking at this hopefully in a permitting in energy and other projects. Again, concerns as to whether you're adhering to one federal decision, whether it's working the way it's supposed to, because this is supposed to be shortening the timelines. It's supposed to be more efficient. It's not skirting any environmental regulations at all. And I don't know. I have frustrations on it, and I don't want to recommend it in a permitting bill if we can't, you're sort of the test case here and coming up a bit short. So could you speak to one federal decision?
Well, we're certainly working to implement one federal decision.
But that's been years, right?
How's that?
That's been years, even before you got there.
Well, I know there was the rule version. Now there's the legislatively mandated version. We're able to act within days to get that first provision out around the categorical exclusions. We're tracking toward those averages that are called for by those provisions in the law, and also trying to make sure there's more transparency and clarity with our permitting processes, including the federal permitting dashboard and the interagency organizations that have been set up to try to make sure that there is clear information and as smooth a process as can be. Again, I think part of what's at play here is that it's not only the things that we're doing as an agency, and there are many, but also how we can make sure the project sponsors are able to do what has to happen on their end, especially when you're working with newer or smaller communities that may be new to receiving federal funds, but that should be no barrier to them succeeding and delivering these projects, and that's important to us.
Yeah, it's pretty discouraging when you talk to a federal agency who can't get, and I'm not saying this is DOT, these are different agencies, but they're projects that are infrastructure development, roads, water projects, and the two agencies aren't even talking, you know, where you have to get permits from both of them, say Fish and Wildlife, Corps of Engineers, EPA. That's the whole point of one federal decision, is to pull those in and have somebody, but I still think there is too much disconnect between these federal agencies, and I'm not even talking about how they interplay with the state ones or even the private developers, because that's an issue as well. At least we could do is have our federal agencies interacting and talking with one another to speed the project. So thank you for working on that. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Reed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for joining us today. As you probably know, Rhode Island is a leader in offshore wind energy in the country, and there are several programs that DOT has, Port Infrastructure Grant programs, the Small Shipyard Program, RAISE grants. Are you, or how are you structuring or restructuring these programs to help accelerate wind energy throughout the country?
Well, wind energy represents a use case that really is newer than some of these programs themselves, at least at the kind of scale that's being supported by facilities and proposed facilities in Rhode Island and elsewhere. Certainly, wind-related projects have been competing well in the Port Infrastructure Development Program, and we've seen how RAISE and potentially other sources of funding can be relevant here as well. What we know is that there is rising demand and enormous opportunity, and part of what I think will be important for us going forward is to make sure that our processes reflect not just the traditional metrics that we use on a transportation basis, but the bigger macroeconomic picture of knowing that if we have the right kind of port facilities, we're supporting a manufacturing base that is onshore here in the U.S. that can create some of this equipment. And we recognize the opportunity and the obligation to support that economic strength with the particular projects that are coming along for consideration.
Well, we are, as you know, because of our leadership, doing exactly that, trying to develop manufacturing and assemblies in our ports, and the assistance of DOT will be helpful. Also, we are trying to electrify our transit system. We have a statewide system. I think we might be unique in the country, and likely will be the first we'll have a totally electric transit system. But supply chain problems, other issues are cropping up. How can you help us get to that electrified system, or hydrogen or hybrid or other non-petroleum products?
Well, we're aware of this interest from the Rhode Island Department and from MBTA, and that could make for better commutes and certainly make for cleaner air as well. I want to take care to note that many of the key early decisions are local, and we respect that. But we'll certainly say that if there is that local commitment coming together in a path forward, and if the project sponsors are interested in pursuing federal funding through our capital investment grants program under the FTA, I would certainly be happy to take a look and to provide technical assistance as they develop that.
Thank you. Just a final point. Quonset State Airport is very critical both to commercial travel and our National Guard. We have the C-130J squadron there. It's absolutely not only critical to the state, but to the nation. And we've been trying to expand that. We've run into some problems. So I would ask your commitment to take a look at the project at Quonset and see if the Department of Transportation could provide any type of assistance to help us get over recent complications.
We'll make sure to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hyde-Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have a couple more questions. Mr. Secretary, I'm a strong proponent of the FAA Contract Tower Program, and it just helps enhance aviation safety at 7 small airports in Mississippi and around the country. However, I have heard concerns that some contract towers lack the same type of equipment as the FAA staffed towers, which is so much has been focused on our conversations of aviation safety and near misses. It seems to me that the controllers at contract tower airports should have access to the same radar displays and other equipment to increase their situational awareness, especially as operations continue to rise. Can you please tell me what steps the FAA is taking to ensure contract towers are properly equipped?
Well, first, let me make clear that the FAA is committed to the contract tower program. We know the difference that it can make at a lot of facilities and communities. And I should note that the funding requested in the President's budget ensures that these federal contract towers will have the staffing that is necessary to meet their safety mission. For FAA-owned facilities, that also goes to equipment needs. Now, there are a number of towers in the program that have expressed interest in additional or different forms of equipment. There's currently not a non-federal system for these towers, but we're actively exploring ways to best meet their needs, recognizing that there is a different setup and a distinct mission that these federal contract towers meet, but wanting to make sure they have everything that's required in order for them to meet that mission.
Thank you for that. And I want to talk a little bit about detectors with the train derailments in the East Palestine, Ohio. There's been a renewed focus on rail safety, obviously, but specifically on the wayside and hot box detectors on train routes. And as you know, trains use these detectors to notify the railroad when there is a problem so it can be addressed. It's my understanding the tracks in East Palestine actually had these detectors. But while mandating this technology may seem like a good idea now, this technology has existed for decades. And I'm just concerned that mandating just this technology would lock the railroads into using outdated technology. So new technologies are already being tested, such as onboard detectors that would monitor each train car from a centralized location. But can you tell me how the administration's budget request keeping pace with the railroads in terms of safety, innovation, and technology using this specific?
Well, the budget request supports the FRA building the team that is needed for everything from inspectors to research and development. And I should note, of course, that our work also supports, with the funding that's come from Congress, supports the physical infrastructure improvements that have benefited rail safety through things like our CRISI program and our railroad crossing elimination program. But specifically with regard to the wayside detection technologies, there are two categories of them. One is those that can detect a developing fault in a rolling stock. That's where you have these so-called hot box detectors that, for example, can note a difference in temperature in a bearing or an axle that could be an indication of a fault. And then others that are effectively sounding an alarm, identifying a condition that requires immediate attention and actions. I don't want to get ahead of the NTSB's findings, which will, when the final report comes out, which may take a year or more, probably have a higher level of detail. But I will say, broadly speaking, our view is that we need more and not less rigorous standards for railroad safety. And that may include technologies, including wayside detection devices, can also include approaches like the added requirements that attach to a high hazard flammable unit train, and just better enforcement capabilities so that we can make sure railroads are accountable for their compliance. Right now, a multi-billion-dollar railroad might face just a six-figure fine, even if found responsible for an egregious violation that resulted in loss of life. And we just don't believe that's enough to get their attention. And it's one of the measures in the proposed bipartisan legislation here in the Senate that we embrace, which is that it would add teeth to those enforcement powers. So whether it's specifically with regard to wayside detection systems or more broadly in terms of the research, the enforcement, and the infrastructure improvements that are being made. I believe this budget will help us prepare for that, but also recognize that this is going to be a journey that has to be refreshed and renewed every single year as we learn more from conditions on the ground.
Thank you very much.
Senator Moran.
Mr. Chairman, thank you and the ranking member. Thank you for Now, I'm pleased to have the opportunity to work with the two of you and others on this subcommittee in my debut appearance at T-Head. Mr. Secretary, welcome. Thank you for the series of telephone conversations we've had in the last few weeks, and I appreciate your presence in front of the committee today. I'd follow up on what the ranking member had to say about the Drive Safe Act. That's a piece of legislation that I introduced with a number of my colleagues. She indicated the lack of use of that program to date. I was glad to hear you indicate you're pursuing changes, improvements, alterations in the program to make sure that we actually get a lot of young drivers into this profession. And so I would just reiterate my support. Thank you for yours. And if we can be of help in trying to accomplish the goals that we mutually share, please put me to work. I'm surprised or disappointed that I'm once again talking about hair follicle testing, which has been a topic of conversation since the FAST Act of 2015 was passed, alternative drug testing for truck drivers. The 2015 FAST Act required HHS to issue scientific and technical guidelines, HHS, for hair testing as a method of truck driving testing program with 1 year of its enactment. Mr. Secretary, I wonder if you had any update on conversations between FMCSA and HHS, anything that is progressing or moving this opportunity along?
Let me get an update for you on that, Senator. As you note, there's a dependency between our authorities and FMCSA and a finding that would have to come from HHS. And we stand ready to work on that as that finding comes through. But I will make sure to determine the latest state of play there and update you accordingly.
Thank you. Thank you for letting me bring that to your attention. Secretary, the short line freight industry is critical to communities across Kansas and across the country. A lot of economic needs. Rail is important to me in Kansas for a number of reasons, but one of them is it's how we haul agriculture commodities from where it's grown to where it's exported or consumed or further refined. The CRISI program has been invaluable in helping address an estimated $12 billion in investments that's needed to ensure that the industry can modernize and meet the need of the country. Any opportunity that you'd like to take now to discuss your commitment to the CRISI program?
Well, let me begin by saying we're committed to the CRISI program. We recognize its importance in both the economic and the safety responsibilities that we have when it comes to rail infrastructure. And I would note that among the $1.4 billion requested for FRA's discretionary programs reflected in the President's budget, there's $510 million identified for CRISI grants, which when you add that to the $1 billion in advance appropriations that came through IIJA would represent a total of over $1.5 billion for the coming fiscal year. And as you note, that program can support the safety, the reliability, the efficiency of these railroads that are so important in every part of the country. We've seen the impact, the result, and the enthusiasm in local communities for what those represent. Passenger rail can even benefit from that when it improves rail that is used by Amtrak and hosted and owned by the freight railroads. And you will see us continuing to move full steam ahead on the use and the deployment of these funds.
Thank you. That's been one of the, I hadn't thought of it until you said it, and I'd highlight it, that it is one of the ways that we've been able to improve Amtrak service through our state is through CRISI grants. My final question, Chairman, is the continued development of advanced air mobility, I think, is hugely important. The AAM Coordination and Leadership Act, which is another one of the pieces of legislation that I've introduced, it became law, introduced it with Senator Sinema. It establishes a working group led by DOT to advance this emerging technology. It was signed into law last year. Is the department fully engaged to ensure that the success of this working group will occur with its particular focus on ability for passenger carrying aircraft that we intended in that legislation? And I would ask that you, in addition to that question, I'd also ask for your commitment that you and the department would provide me with updates throughout the process of this committee doing its work.
We'll make sure to do that, and we recognize the enormous promise of advanced air mobility, and that it creates a number of novel questions and challenges that are different in kind than what the FAA and the administration are used to managing. So the committee, that process that you referenced, and the agenda of the FAA more broadly to prepare the airspace for this is high on our minds, and we'll continue pursuing it in ways that meet our safety mission while also being compatible with the competitive and prompt development of these new technologies so that America is a leader as we're accustomed to being in aviation writ large.
Prompt, Mr. Secretary, is my goal in raising this topic. We face a competitive world, and we want the United States to be the leader in this emerging technology.
Agreed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Bozeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here today and testifying. I know you've got a lot going on. I've really just got a couple questions that I think are important. Nearly 87% of Arkansas communities depend exclusively on trucks to move their goods. Since the vast majority of my constituents rely on, and this is true of so many other areas throughout the country, efficient trucking operations, I'm really interested in the Department of Transportation's long-term plan to build our truck parking capacity. We've heard repeatedly from representatives of the trucking industry that the nationwide shortage of truck parking capacity is a key driver of supply chain inefficiency. In fact, for every 11 drivers, there's only one truck parking space. So, Mr. Secretary, would the establishment of a competitive grant program for truck parking projects better equip DOT and the states to address the longstanding challenge? And if so, or if not, how can we help you accomplish, something that really is a major problem now and is probably only going to get worse in the future?
Well, I completely agree with the importance of this issue. When you talk with truck drivers, it's one of the first things that they'll raise. And it's not just a matter of convenience, it's really a matter of safety.
Right.
It means that as a driver is on their route, they see that they're getting close to the limit of their hours of service. They're faced with a choice either to stop short and lose income, if there's even a space near them, or to park in a place that could be unsafe. Yeah. So,
and I don't mean to interrupt, but I'm told that literally drivers will drive around for an hour, hour and a half, trying to find a spot before their hours run out, so they'll stay within the time frame.
Or face being compelled to park on those ramps, which
Exactly.
is not safe for them or for other drivers. So in terms of a dedicated program, we'd welcome a dialogue on that. I do want to make sure in the meantime you're aware that we're using the funding we do have for these purposes. We were able, through our discretionary programs, I believe infra, but I will double check with the course, to fund both Florida and Tennessee working on projects to do just this, to add truck parking spaces. And I would add there's some interesting technologies developing that can help drivers know in real time where some of those spaces might be available to avoid just that scenario that you're describing of circling around, which benefits no one. So we'll continue to consider this a valid use in any discretionary program where it's permitted under statute. Secondly, we have taken steps to urge state DOTs to recognize that this is often an eligible use of their federal aid highway formula funds. We would love to see more of those funds going to that purpose. But third, if there's an opportunity to investigate dedicated programming, I certainly recognize that would meet a need.
Well, we would really like to work with you, and I think I can speak for the committee in the sense that this is, such an important area. To go forward and help you with the projects that you've got going now, but also try and figure out a future way to perhaps, help alleviate this.
Likewise.
The other thing is the Appropriations Committee has been diligent over the past several years in funding the FAA Air Traffic Organization at or near the requested levels in the President's budget. With that said, I've heard a lot of aviation stakeholders mention the funding is simply not enough to meet the air traffic goals. And I note that your budget request included a $1.4 billion increase for FAA, with most of that directed towards air traffic. Can you explain where the increased funding will be directed if Congress funds the air traffic request and the need for that?
Certainly. We see more pressure than ever on the national aviation system. Some of that comes from, by way of economic good news, which is the increased demand and interest in flight. But we have to make sure the systems are keeping pace. And even if it weren't for that surge, there are ongoing needs that we need to make sure that the FAA can meet. So part of what you're seeing in the increase is an $800 million increase for the operations side. That includes air traffic control hiring and training. We had 1,500 controllers hired in fiscal year '23, and we'll need the funding to continue training them, and then project another 1,800 for fiscal '24. And even allowing for attrition, that represents an expansion in workforce, which I think is very much needed right now. There's also funding for the sustainment of the National Airspace System. That is the kind of field and software maintenance programs, telecommunication systems, trying to reduce the risk of system outages. And then a number of other proposals that are really about getting ready for the future or addressing requirements to the Aircraft Certification Reform Act. There's also a $600 million increase in the facilities and equipment side. And I want to point in particular to $115 million for modernization, which would allow us to move forward faster on things like the NOTAMs modernization that started in 2019, and phase 1 is set to be done in 2025. Obviously, we're very interested in how to accelerate that, as well as the telecommunications infrastructure, which is running on technology that telecom operators tell us they will not support indefinitely. And so we really need to make that change from TDM, so-called technology, to Internet Protocol technology, just to give you a flavor of some of the steps. The last thing I'd point to is research and development, which is an important area always for FAA. And of course, this sits alongside the Airport Improvement Program funds on FAA's books, which allow us to benefit airports of all sizes across the country.
Right. Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Manchin.
Thank you, Secretary. I appreciate it very much. First of all, I want to say I think Senator Hyde-Smith mentioned this about rural areas and the funding, and in the raise in for rural and mega grant programs. So the only thing I want to say is that we've been trying to, and I'm trying to get this, and all of us come from rural states. 20% of the population of America lives in rural America, classified, 66 million people. And I guarantee you, we get less than single digits when all the funding comes from federal. I don't think it's directed or intentionally. It just happens because there's so much scale of economies in larger areas. But we're trying to make sure. So in a situation such as this, the $5.2 billion, $1 billion of that should have been designated for rural areas to get its appropriate share. And I think if you look, it didn't happen that way. Very large cities got most of it. But I want to bring that to your attention because we're trying to pass an overall piece of sweeping legislation that says the 20%. So anything you can do to maybe bring your staff up to speed on looking at that when we disperse monies out into rural areas would be very, very helpful. On the funding for alternative fuel refueling stations, what we're concerned about there, there's more than just EV charging stations that we're concerned about. I'm concerned about the horsepower that it takes to run the big trucks, that runs the things that we need, and that's going to be hydrogen as we transition. And I hope that you're looking at that as aggressively as you are the EVs that we're moving very rapidly in, and it's going to be needed for us to meet the demands because EVs will not carry the trucks and the big heavy loads that we need, and also in our trains and things of that sort. And I don't know if you all have looked at it differently than that.
Sure, yeah, we share your interest in hydrogen. One thing I would note is that while the NEVI program with the states is focused on EV infrastructure, the $2.5 billion charging fuel infrastructure program includes hydrogen as an eligible use.
I think you're going to push that yourself a little bit, sir. Take the lead on that, because if not, it might lag behind because of the over-anxious desire to get EVs out the door quicker than...
We certainly recognize for trucks. Also, I would note for buses, there's a lot of interest.
Yeah. This technology, go back to the 90s. We had a hydrogen fueling station in West Virginia back in the 90s, but it didn't get the support it needed, so it went nowhere. We've never matured that industry. We're determined to get it done this time. If I could go to the rail situation, we had a disaster in 2015, but up until that, we've had the electronic control pneumatic brakes. I think you and I have talked about it briefly. That was started back, 9 years, started in 2006. It had gone through all the testing and everything, and by 2015 we thought we had it. Then we had the wreck in West Virginia with carrying the Balkan. And now Then it was kind of put on the sidelines through the 2016, 2020 period. So only thing I would say, the technology exists, it's been successfully filled, tested, and we think that it would have been very helpful in preventing some of these horrific train accidents. So only thing I would like for you all, and hopefully you would commit to have the Federal Railroad Administration to revisit the ECP brake system.
Well, thank you for that, and we are interested in the ECP brake opportunities. As you know, the FAST Act constrains us to some extent in our ability to apply it, but I've directed our team to look at everything we can do within those constraints, and also would welcome partnering with Congress to loosen those constraints. I will note, now that positive train control is fully deployed, there would need to be some steps to make sure that we get the right compatibility between PTC and ECP, but I certainly continue to view this as a potentially very important safety.
If you can keep up us to speed, basically on the technology and what changes have been made, and if they are adaptable, it would be very helpful on that, and hopefully we can expedite that. Pilot shortage, okay? Especially, we're affected more in rural areas than most because when pilot shortage, we're the first routes to get cut because of economics. The 65, as a pilot myself, way above the 67 age, we're still able to fly. We can still make pretty good decisions to keep our lives, if you will, and those of who are entrusted in it. I don't know, I would hope that you all would consider the 65 to 67 age increasement. It would be very helpful for us to meet the challenges we have all over America, especially rural America.
Well, as you know, that's set statutorily, and it conforms to the ICAO level of 65, and so any variance from that could create international issues, but always looking primarily to the data, and would want to see any kind of data that could inform any measure related to the future pilot workforce. We can't and won't do anything that could compromise safety, but are interested in anything and everything that we could do that meets that test, including encouraging and helping more people get started as pilots.
We have a bill with Senator Graham that we think might help you a little bit, so we're gonna try to pursue that one, and hopefully you all take a good look at it and see what you think. Finally, hold on, we have one here on hydrogen. What has been included in the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration spending plan to address my concerns about the safety and blending of hydrogen into existing older pipelines? Also, you know, the jurisdictional situation that we have with transmission and pipelines, we've been contemplating putting under one roof. And I know how staffs may be territorial on this, but we're thinking with FERC, where we've had all of our pipelines and transmission, we're looking at that for a new permitting bill. Really want your input on that to help we can do that and basically synchronize this better.
We'll
Safety on pipelines first, if you can, and hit that.
Sure, yeah, we got
I'm so sorry, Senator.
$228.2 million assigned for pipeline safety. That includes operations, R&D on things like leak detection, and grants to states. Because
Right.
we know how important those can be. On the structural matter, we would defer to Congress, but happy to work with you on that.
Okay, but on the pipelines, the type of, I'm told we have a lot of pipelines in existing right now. Also, that it can carry certain amounts, up to 20% of hydrogen right now, the same pipelines. Some of the pipelines can be basically retrofitted, what we call sleeved, if you will, a new pipeline inside that. As we transition into more hydrogen, we're going to need help from you all right now and support. If we can use the existing right-of-ways that doesn't have to go through all the environmental considerations, that basically that pipeline is already there, why can't we repurpose it for the same purpose that we have now as we transition to other fuels?
I see.
So hopefully you all will be looking at that for us. Thank you, Secretary, I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, you've been so kind.
No problem, Senator Manchin. I just have two final questions. We provided some seed money to begin the planning process for ARPA-I, and the President's budget is requesting $19 million for the next phase. What are your short-term accomplishments and your long-term goals for the program?
Well, thank you. We're very excited about ARPA-I. It's patterned after the successful ARPA-E and DARPA and ARPA models. They provide advanced research that just isn't being met by other bodies, and we think could help lead to transformative benefits in transportation areas of interest, including safety. With the $3.2 million that Congress provided for this fiscal year, we've begun the development process to stand this up, including a staffing plan, and preparing to provide an outline of research activities to Congress in the coming weeks, followed by a strategic vision that we will seek to get to Congress by October. And ARPA-I has begun conducting outreach, workshops, and other launch activities. With the $19 million requested in the fiscal '24 budget, we would be able to advance this work, fully build out ARPA-I, and begin pursuing projects that could make a difference on things like breakthrough intersection safety systems, which could reduce fatalities at intersections that right now claim 10,000 lives per year in the United States. So while this is not the biggest dollar amount you will see in the budget, I think it is one of the areas where we may see the most bang for our taxpayer buck, in the same way that the original DARPA famously generated trillion-dollar ideas like the internet itself, based on the research funding that was provided to them.
Thank you. Senator Feinstein can't join us today, but she has a time-sensitive question regarding environmental protections for the Brightline West Rail project. Can you follow up with her office directly?
We'll make sure to do that, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Senator Hoeven.
Mr. Secretary, one of the things that we've worked very hard on in North Dakota is developing the unmanned aviation systems in the Grand Forks region. And we have a test site there, the Great Plains Test Site. We've worked with the Grand Forks Air Force Base. We have a technology park there, Grand Sky Technology Park. And so we've developed an incredible partnership and can do a lot more to fly unmanned aircraft in the NAS safely and well. We've been working with Bill Nolan, the acting administrator right now. He has been helpful, and we appreciate it. What can you do to help us continue to advance that industry?
Well, first of all, North Dakota rightly has a lot to be proud of with regard to the research and the work that's gone on here. I've spoken with your governor about it too, and we view it as a major national area of interest in aviation. These uncrewed aircraft systems, or UAS, are, we think, going to transform a number of aviation uses, and some of those maybe sooner than people think, especially with regard to use cases like deliveries to remote or rural areas for urgently needed pharmaceutical supplies, something we're supporting a little bit of research on through our SMART grants. I would direct your attention to the budget request, which will total $138.9 million for fiscal '24 across different activities related to UAS. That would advance drone integration into the NAS by supporting the development of the policies, the procedures, and the standards that we're going to need, recognizing that this is just different, related but different from traditional crewed aircraft. That's going to include partnerships with other agencies and with industry on safety. It's going to require clear standards and rules on things like beyond visual line of sight operations, forecasting and processing of the different authorizations that are going to be needed. So we are enthusiastic about the potential of this technology. We also recognize that it's going to create a lot of challenges, and we will diligently put these requested dollars to use advancing that.
And you're committed to helping us develop UAS in our test site and for the country.
Would welcome continuing to work with you on that.
All right, the other issue I want to bring up to you is supply chain issues. Obviously, inflation is an incredible problem right now. We need to do everything we can to get it under control. Too much spending here in D.C. is a big part of the problem. But the supply chain issues are a huge issue, and that involves everything from farmers getting containers, loading those containers at the ports, getting adequate truck drivers. I just recently saw that the AGC, Associated General Contractors, said that they're not able to get enough skilled tradesmen. Across the board, we're seeing a real challenge with these supply chain issues. Obviously, in some cases, it's too much regulation. In some cases, they're not able to get the people, just the whole gamut. So we've got to get people back into the workforce. We've got to train them expeditiously. We've got to make sure that small business doesn't have a regulatory burden that holds them back from doing what they need to do to knock down these supply chain barriers and get this terrible inflation down, which is, as you know, very difficult for the American people. What are you doing to make sure that we solve these supply chain issues?
Well, agreed, this continues to be a major concern, and it's driven by a number of factors. Certainly, the extremely low unemployment rate right now is a factor, and the fact that the economic demand and the growth in our economy came roaring back at a pace that even the most optimistic scenarios just a couple of years ago didn't anticipate has put strain on the system. Let me mention a nearer-term effort and then a longer-term view. The nearer-term effort that I'd invite your attention to is a program called FLOW. This is by no means the biggest dollar amount you're going to see in the budget. It's about $5.3 million requested to support 8 positions. But this emerges from a partnership that we formed with industry, retailers like Target, Walmart, and Home Depot, logistics companies like FedEx, UPS, and DHL, shippers like Maersk and MSC, and ports like Long Beach, Newark, and Georgia, to make sure that better information and data sharing took place. And to your point about small business, you know, the very biggest firms sometimes have their own supply chains and are not feeling the pinch in the same way that, for example, my in-laws' family business does when they can't get the hardware that they need on time and can't exactly send a ship to go get it. We will be able to do more work with this so-called FLOW program that I think will make a big difference, and would also just echo your point that this is connected to the fight against inflation. Certainly encouraged to see that the cost of ocean shipping in the Pacific is down 80%, because we know that when it was at those sky-high rates, that's one of the things that led to inflation at its peak that we observed a few months ago. There's a long way to go in making sure that we address those issues.
We need to see more help for small business to really get through these supply chain issues.
Agreed. And if I could just point to one other thing, we're also mindful of this in our grant making and the infrastructure work that we're doing, that we've got to shore up the infrastructure that those supply chains move across, even while we're working to support the private sector doing what it does best.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary. Thank you for your testimony today. Thank you for your partnership with this committee. We've got a lot of work to do to pass an appropriations bill, but I'm confident that we will get there. The hearing record will remain open until Friday, April 7th, to allow members to submit additional questions for the record. This hearing is now adjourned.